The Seattle rain drummed a relentless rhythm against the siding of my parents' cramped house. I stood on the welcome mat, my coat heavy with water, listening to the destruction of my life through the thin oak door. At family dinner, I overheard my parents planning to move my brother's family into my $450,000 condo for free. I smiled and stayed quiet. I let them pack and brag, then I sold it and vanished. 89 missed calls later, the silence is finally mine. I took a slow breath, arranging my features into a mask of holiday warmth. I pushed the door open to find the air thick with the scent of pot roast and damp wool. My brother, Caleb, was leaning back in a chair he had not paid for, his feet scuffing the floor. My father, Richard, leaned over a napkin covered in scribbled floor plans. They looked up with the raw panic of conspirators, caught with the blueprints to the bank vault. Their smiles arrived a second too late. Richard cleared his throat and slid the napkin under his plate. He looked at me with the wary appraisal of a man who knows he owes a debt he cannot pay. My mother rushed forward to take my coat, her touch feeling like dry paper against my skin. She told me how successful I looked and how much Caleb needed a win this year. I watched her eyes dart toward the napkin. They were already moving furniture in their minds, colonizing my personal sanctuary. I sat in the hard wooden chair at the edge of the table. Caleb offered me a smirk that bordered on insolence while he nursed an expensive beer. He talked about his latest failed startup, like it was a temporary setback rather than a final collapse. My parents nodded in sympathetic unison, casting glances at each other that spoke of a secret victory. I realized then that they saw me as a resource rather than a person. I was just a communal asset they had not liquidated yet. The conversation turned toward my upcoming deployment to Tokyo. Richard's voice grew deep and paternal as he mentioned how lonely the condo would be while I was away. He spoke about the importance of family guarding one's legacy. I kept my voice even and professional as I agreed with every manipulative point he made. I even suggested that the natural light in my loft would be perfect for a nursery. The room suddenly felt warmer as their greed transformed into a toxic, celebratory joy. I reached into my bag and pulled out a vintage bottle of wine as a sedative for the evening. As Richard poured the glasses, they toasted to my generosity and their bright future. I felt a profound, icy detachment while the liquid hit the back of my throat. They thought they had just secured a luxury asset through a clever trick. They did not realize I had already contacted a developer to gut the building. I walked back out into the rain, leaving the keys under the mat. The drive back to my loft felt like a funeral procession for my childhood. My knuckles were white against the leather steering wheel as I replayed Caleb's smug grin. He was already planning which walls to tear down for his home theater. My phone buzzed in the cup holder with a text from my mother. Slept. She wanted to know if I had left the garage code written down. They were moving faster than I had anticipated. The elevator opened directly into my sanctuary of glass and polished concrete. Everything here was a result of 70-hour work weeks and calculated risks. I walked to the floor, to ceiling windows and watched the city lights blur through the sleet. My objective was simple now: total liquidation before they could establish residency. I opened my laptop and pulled up the mental ledger I had kept for years. Caleb owed me $50,000 in unrecorded loans. The primary obstacle arrived as a sharp knock on my door at midnight. I looked at the security feed to see Caleb standing there with a duffel bag. He wasn't waiting for my trip to Tokyo to start his takeover. He claimed his apartment lease ended early, and he needed just a few days of grace. The pressure in my chest tightened as he pushed past me into the kitchen. He was testing the boundaries already. Caleb began opening my cabinets with the casual arrogance of a conqueror. He complained that I didn't have enough snacks for his kids. I stood by the marble island, watching him leave greasy fingerprints on my surfaces. He mentioned that our father had given him his spare key for emergencies. That was the mid-scene turn that changed everything. My own father had actively assisted in this trespass. The betrayal was no longer just a plan. I realized then that I could not wait for my flight to act. I pulled out my phone and sent a priority message to Julian. He was a developer who had been circling this historic building for months. I told him I was ready to sell under his aggressive cash terms. Caleb was busy measuring the living room for a sectional sofa, oblivious to my digital movements. The power balance shifted as I hit the send button. I was a ghost. Julian replied within minutes with a formal offer that required an immediate signature. I watched Caleb lounge on my Italian leather sofa while I signed away the deed. The contract included a clause for an immediate gut renovation starting in 48 hours. My brother looked at me and asked if I was excited for Japan. I told him I had never felt more ready to leave. He laughed, thinking he had won the ultimate prize for free. I spent the rest of the night packing my proprietary servers into discreet crates. Caleb fell asleep on the couch, snoring loudly into the quiet air of my home. I looked at the spare key my father had given him, lying on the coffee table. It was a useless piece of metal now that the locks were scheduled for replacement. Tomorrow, a demolition crew would arrive to reclaim the space. My brother was sleeping in a demolition zone. The sun rose over the sound, casting a cold gray light across the living room. Caleb was still sprawled on the sofa, surrounded by empty beer cans and the smell of stale yeast. My objective was to clear out my remaining high-value assets before the moving truck arrived at noon. I worked in silence, packing the last of my vintage watches in the heavy silver. Each click of latch felt like a final goodbye to this life. Slept. The primary obstacle appeared as a frantic phone call from my mother at 9. She wanted to know why a realtor's lockbox was suddenly attached to my front door downstairs. I could hear Caleb stirring on the couch, his eyes bleary and confused. I lied smoothly, telling her it was just for the building's insurance inspection. The pressure rose as she mentioned she was bringing over his wife and the kids for a walk through. I accelerated my pace, moving toward the master closet to retrieve my hidden fire safe. Caleb sat up, scratching his chest and staring at the stacks of boxes I had staged. He asked why I was packing so much for a 3-month trip to Tokyo. I told him I was just organizing the space for his family to be comfortable. He seemed satisfied, but his eyes lingered on the high-end espresso machine I was currently unplugging. The mid-scene turn came when I handed Caleb a legal-sized envelope marked for our father. I told him it contained the deed transfer and instructions for the utilities. Caleb's chest puffed out with a sudden, misplaced sense of authority as he gripped the paper. He didn't know the envelope actually contained a formal notice of the property sale. He felt like the new king of the castle, while I was simply the departing servant. I watched him walk to the balcony to survey his new kingdom with an arrogant smirk. Below us, the white moving truck finally pulled into the loading zone. I had hired them to take everything of value to a secure, climate-controlled unit. Caleb assumed they were here to bring his furniture in early. I let him believe the lie, even helping him move his duffel bag to the hallway. The power balance was now entirely in my hands. The movers worked with military precision, stripping the loft of its soul in under 2 hours. Caleb stood in the middle of the increasingly empty space, looking slightly unsettled by the naked walls. I told him the new furniture was coming tomorrow, and he should get the family ready. He nodded, clutching the envelope like a holy relic. I walked out the door with my suitcase, never planning to look back at the glass sanctuary. I reached the sidewalk and watched the moving truck disappear into the city traffic. My phone chimed with a notification from the bank, confirming Julian's massive wire transfer. The sale was final, and the demolition crew was officially dispatched for the next morning. Then, I saw my father's car turn the corner, filled with Caleb's screaming children and boxes. They were arriving 12 hours before the sledgehammers. I had underestimated their desperate, hungry speed. I ducked behind a concrete pillar to avoid my father's line of sight. My primary objective was to reach the airport without a face-to-face confrontation that would reveal the trap. If they caught me now, the demolition crew might face a legal injunction before the first strike. I watched through the lobby glass as my father helped Caleb's wife unload a plastic high chair. The invasion had begun earlier than my risk models had originally predicted. The pressure escalated when my mother spotted my suitcase from across the street. She waved frantically, her face twisted in a mask of maternal concern that no longer fooled me. I had to pivot quickly to maintain the illusion of the helpful brother. I told her I was rushing to catch an earlier flight due to a sudden weather warning in Tokyo. She nodded, distracted by a toddler who was already rubbing chocolate on the lobby's marble. Caleb emerged from the elevator, still holding the legal envelope I had handed him earlier. He slapped my father on the back, boasting about how I had cleared the space just for them. My father looked at me with a rare, approving nod that felt like a cold blade. He thanked me for finally doing the right thing for the family's future. It was the mid-scene turn. They were truly convinced that they had finally broken my will. I handed my mother a small stack of gift cards for a local hardware store. I told her they were for any minor repairs or paint they might need for the nursery. In reality, I knew they would try to use them once the building was already a shell. Her eyes welled with tears as she called me her most reliable child. The subtext was clear: my utility was my only value. I checked my watch and backed toward the curb. A black SUV pulled up, the driver nodding as he opened the trunk for my luggage. I looked at the loft one last time, seeing Caleb's kids pressing their faces against the glass. Slept. They were 300 feet above the pavement, celebrating a victory that was already turning to ash. I realized then that I felt no pity for the children. Slept. Only a clinical detachment. They were being raised by wolves who lived on stolen meat and false promises. I climbed into the back seat and told the driver to head toward the airport. As we pulled away, I saw my father struggling with a heavy box of Caleb's old trophies. They were moving their past into a space that had no future. My phone buzzed with a message from Julian confirming the demolition permits were posted on the back door. The legal machinery was moving. The wrecking ball was now a mathematical certainty for the morning. The driver turned onto the highway, leaving the skyline behind in a haze of winter gray. I pulled up the security feed one last time to watch them settle into the empty loft. They were sitting on the floor, eating pizza and laughing about their cleverness. Then I noticed something new in the corner of the frame. My father was holding a crowbar. moving toward the master bedroom wall to start an unapproved renovation tonight. He was impatient. The airport lounge was a tomb of hushed voices and expensive upholstery. My primary objective was to maintain radio silence while Julian's legal team filed the final occupancy disclosures. I watched the screen as my father swung the crowbar with a grunt of misplaced ambition. He was trying to find a load-bearing beam to hang a swing for the grandchildren. Each strike of metal against the 1920s brick felt like a heartbeat. He was destroying his own evidence before the real demolition even started. Slept. The primary obstacle flared when an alert popped up on my laptop screen. The building manager had been tipped off by the noise and was heading to my unit with security. If they were evicted tonight for a noise violation, they might discover the sale before the crew arrived. I had to intervene remotely without revealing my hand to my family. I quickly messaged the manager, claiming I had authorized a late-night contractor for a plumbing emergency. The pressure shifted from my chest back to the screen. I watched the manager pause at my door, then walk away after reading my urgent email. Caleb appeared in the frame, holding a beer, and laughing at our father's clumsy handiwork. He looked so comfortable in the space I had built with 15 years of sweat. It was the mid-scene turn that solidified my resolve. They weren't just taking my home, they were actively desecrating the history I had carefully restored. They treated my legacy like a cheap hotel room, meant for trashing. The power balance shifted as I initiated the remote wipe of the home automation system. I didn't want them to have control over the lights or the smart locks during the eviction. I watched the living room plunge into a dim, flickering emergency mode. Caleb cursed and shook his phone, confused by the sudden loss of connectivity. My father stopped his demolition work, staring at the darkened ceiling with a growing sense of unease. The shadows in the loft began to look like teeth. I felt a cold surge of satisfaction as I closed the laptop lid. The plane was boarding, and the first-class cabin offered a temporary sanctuary from the carnage. I handed my ticket to the attendant, my movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. I was no longer the reliable son or the bankroll for their failures. I was a ghost moving toward a new life in a city where they could never find me. The transition from host to predator was finally complete. The flight was a blur of high-altitude silence and the hum of jet engines. I checked my phone one last time before switching to airplane mode. A new notification appeared from the smart doorbell I had hidden in the hallway. Julian's demolition lead was already at the building, 3 hours ahead of schedule. He was checking the structural integrity of the front door for the heavy equipment. The timeline was accelerating, and my family was still trapped inside the dark, hollowed-out unit. The micro twist hit just as the wheels left the tarmac. I saw a final image of my brother's wife, opening one of the housewarming gifts I had left behind. She wasn't looking at the debt notices yet. She was holding a small, blinking GPS tracker I had hidden inside the festive gold wrapping. I hadn't just sold the condo. I had ensured I could watch their exact movements once they were back on the street. The hunt was just beginning, and they were the tagged prey. The first-class cabin smelled of expensive leather and chilled air as the plane leveled out over the Pacific. Slept. My primary objective was to watch the demolition of my old life from 30,000 feet. I opened my laptop and connected to the high-speed satellite internet, pulling up the hidden security feed. The loft was a dark, cavernous pit on my screen, illuminated only by the frantic beam of Caleb's flashlight. He was stumbling over the thrift store junk I had staged in the living room. The trap was fully active now. The primary obstacle flared on the screen when my father began hammering on the locked front door from the inside. The smart locks had engaged a deadbolt that required my biometric signature to release. He was trapped in a unit that was no longer legally mine. Screaming at a camera he could not see. The pressure escalated as I saw my mother clutching her chest, looking like she was having a panic attack near the kitchen island. I watched her struggle to breathe while Caleb kicked the door in a blind, drunken rage. A notification pinned on my dashboard as the building's main power was officially cut by the utility company. The emergency lights flickered once and died, leaving my family in absolute, terrifying darkness. This was the mid-scene turn that stripped them of their remaining bravado. Without the ability to see the exits, they were just four frightened animals in a glass cage. I could see their heat signatures on the infrared feed, huddled together like a dying flame. The power balance had shifted from familial manipulation to raw, industrial survival. The heavy thud of a battering ram echoed through the laptop speakers as the demolition lead, Marcus, arrived. He did not knock, because he had the legal right to enter a vacant construction site. The front door groaned under the mechanical pressure, the hinges screaming as they were forced out of the frame. I watched Marcus step into the foyer with 5 men wearing hard hats and carrying yellow sledgehammers. They did not look like movers. They looked like an execution squad for a property that had lived too long. Richard tried to stand tall, waving his crowbar at the intruders with the fake authority of a cornered thief. Marcus didn't flinch or argue with the gray-haired man. He simply held up a printed copy of the deed and the immediate demolition order. The dialogue was short, punchy, and utterly final. Marcus told them they had exactly 3 minutes to leave before the heavy machinery began tearing down the walls. My father's fate turned a dangerous shade of purple as the reality of the sale finally hit him. Caleb's wife began tearing open the gold-wrapped boxes I had left on the master bedroom shelf. She was looking for a miracle, but she only found the cold, hard paper of their failures. She pulled out the debt notices and the cancellation of the insurance policies I had been secretly funding. The realization hit her like a physical blow, sending her sliding down the wall. She wasn't holding housewarming gifts. She was holding a detailed map of the financial ruins I had left in my wake. The first sledgehammer strike hit the kitchen island with a sound that vibrated through my noise-canceling headphones. Marble shattered and wood splintered under the weight of the blow. My family scrambled to grab their meager belongings, realizing that the house was literally coming down around them. They were being evicted from a sanctuary they never earned and a payroll they had exploited for decades. I felt no pity as I watched them retreat toward the hallway. They were finally feeling the cold rain of a real, unshielded consequence. Marcus watched them leave with a professional disdain that was beautiful to witness from my distant seat. He signaled the crew to proceed with the primary structural demolition of the north brick wall. I watched the wall I had spent months restoring crumble into a pile of red dust and gray mortar. It was a cleansing fire made of iron and sweat. My past was being pulverized into debris that would be hauled away by noon. The host was gone, and the parasites were finally out in the cold. I closed the laptop as the flight attendant arrived with a fresh glass of champagne. The screen went black, but I could still see the red heat signatures in my mind. The micro twist came as a final text message. Bypassed my block through an emergency channel. It was from the building manager, stating that the police were arresting my father for the illegal renovation damage. He had used a crowbar on a load-bearing wall that now belonged to a billionaire. Richard wasn't just homeless, he was a felon. The plane began its long descent toward Narita International Airport. My primary objective was to ensure the financial severance was as irreversible as the physical demolition. I pulled up my banking application to verify the final status of the secondary accounts. These were the hidden conduits I used to pay for Caleb's lifestyle. One by one, I clicked the buttons to terminate the recurring transfers and close the associated credit lines. The digital lifeblood of their household was officially severed. I felt a cold surge of finality with every confirmation. The primary obstacle arrived as the plane touched down, and my phone reconnected to the network. A flood of emergency notifications from the Seattle Police Department illuminated the dark screen. Richard had apparently tried to fight the arresting officers during the eviction. The pressure mounted as I realized he was being held on a high cash bond. My mother was already calling my old office, begging for a way to reach me. They were drowning, and they still expected me to be their lifeguard. I ignored the vibrations and walked through the terminal toward the customs desk. The mid-scene turn happened when I received a secure message from my lawyer back home. He had successfully transferred the remaining trust funds into a new, irrevocable structure. These assets were now protected from any legal claims or lawsuits my family might file. My parents could no longer sue me for the value of the condo I had sold. I had effectively vaporized my own net worth to make it untouchable. The power balance was now absolute as I stepped into the cool, humid air of Tokyo. I hailed a black sedan and gave the driver the address of my new corporate housing. My phone continued to scream with missed calls from unknown numbers in the Seattle area code. I knew it was Caleb, likely calling from a motel or a payphone near the station. I watched the neon lights of the city blur into a streak of vibrant, neon blue. I was finally anonymous. I reached the apartment and stood on the balcony, overlooking the crowded streets of Shinjuku. The objective of total isolation was nearly complete, but the emotional momentum was still heavy. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of ozone and city rain fill my lungs. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the physical SAM card from my old life. It was a small, gold-plated chip that held a decade of manipulation and guilt. I held it over the railing. I dropped the card, watching it disappear into the sea of moving cars 30 stories below. The connection was physically broken, leaving me in a state of perfect, silent equilibrium. I realized then that I had not just sold a piece of real estate. I had sold the version of myself that was a servant to their incompetence. I walked back inside and closed the sliding glass door, locking the world out. The silence in the room was the greatest luxury I owned. The next morning, I visited a small shrine in the heart of the city to clear my head. I watched a monk sweep the gravel with a rhythmic, scratching sound that calmed my racing nerves. I felt a sense of peace that had been missing since I was a child. I was no longer the guardian of their failures or the architect of their comfort. I was a man with a clean ledger and a future of my own making. I felt truly light. A week later, a courier delivered a package to my office from a local law firm in Seattle. It contained the final, signed papers from the developer, Julian, confirming the total destruction of the loft. He included a photo of the empty lot where the building once stood proudly. The historic brick was gone, replaced by a flat plain of gray gravel and orange cones. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My sanctuary had been successfully purged from the earth. I sat at my desk and opened the final file my lawyer had sent regarding Caleb's debt. He had been served with a notice that I was no longer the guarantor of his loans. The creditors would be arriving at my parents' house by the end of the month to seize assets. This was the final, irreversible blow to their remaining social standing and pride. They were about to lose everything they had used to pretend they were successful. The game was over. The micro twist came when I received an email from an old high school friend who still lived nearby. He mentioned that Caleb had been spotted trying to sell my old furniture from a storage unit. I laughed quietly to myself, knowing that the furniture was all cheap, thrift, stored junk I had staged. Caleb was trying to sell garbage to pay off millions in debt. He didn't even realize that he was still playing the lead role in my final, parting joke. 6 months later, Kyoto smells of damp cedar and ancient stone. I sit on the wooden porch of my townhouse, watching the morning mist cling to the moss. My primary objective is the final closure of my past. I hold a physical letter from Sabrina, Caleb's wife, that somehow bypassed my digital firewalls. It is stained with ink and desperation. She claims they're living in a roadside motel now. Her words feel like echoes from a world that has already ended. The primary obstacle arrives as a heavy sense of residual guilt. I read about the collection agents seizing my mother's car and the bank foreclosure. My brother's wife begs for a small loan just to cover the baby's medical checkup. The pressure to intervene is a ghost limb that still twitches with old conditioning. I stare at the letter, waiting for the familiar ache of responsibility to surface. It never comes. The silence of the garden is far more persuasive than her tears. The mid-scene turn occurs when I reach the final page of her frantic scribbling. She mentions that our father died of a stroke 3 weeks ago. She blames me for the stress that finally broke his heart. The power balance is now entirely internal. I am the judge and the jury of my own soul. I look at the stone lantern in the yard and realize I feel nothing. Not joy. Not sorrow. Just the relief of a long, overdue debt being settled. I realized that my lie was believing they were capable of love. The truth is that they were only capable of consumption. I was never a brother or a son to them. I was merely a line of credit that finally reached its limit. I fold the letter into a small, tight square. My need for autonomy has finally eclipsed my need for their hollow approval. I am a man who has successfully retired from a toxic career. The ledger is finally closed. I stand up and walk to the small iron brazier in the corner of the room. I drop the letter onto the glowing coals and watch the paper curl into black ash. The smoke rises, blending with the fog that rolls off the mountains. I have fulfilled my final promise to myself. I am free. There are no more missed calls to answer, and no more fires to extinguish. I turn my back on the embers and step into the cool, dark house. The micro twist arrives when I check my business email one last time before bed. Slept. A new notification from my lawyer appears regarding the secret trusts for my nephews. The boys have been removed from Caleb's custody due to his mounting legal troubles. They are safe in a school. I am quietly funding through an anonymous foundation. I have saved the only part of the family worth keeping. However, the lawyer mentions that Caleb is currently on a plane to Tokyo.